The dynamics of policy agendas, how issues rise, fall, and persist in public policy. Introduction. Why do some issues rise to the top of governmental agendas while others remain ignored? What forces determine which policies receive serious government attention and which remain on the periphery? Political scientists have long studied the mechanisms that shape policy agendas, offering explanations that highlight the interplay of problem recognition, institutional structures, and political actors. Among the most influential frameworks in this field are John Kingdon's multiple streams framework and Baumgartner and Jones' punctuated equilibrium model. These theories illustrate how political, institutional, and social forces interact to drive policy change, or preserve the status quo. This chapter explores the major theories of agenda setting, the role of policy monopolies, and how valence issues, such as drug abuse and child welfare, rise to prominence but often fail to yield substantive policy solutions. Through an examination of key case studies, the chapter highlights how policies can shift dramatically when political windows of opportunity open, and why some issues remain central to policy debates long after public attention has moved elsewhere. Part 1. Foundations of Agenda Setting. Punctuated equilibria in politics. For much of history, policy change has been viewed as a gradual process, with incremental adjustments made over time. However, Baumgartner and Jones challenge this view through their theory of punctuated equilibrium, which posits that policymaking is characterized by long periods of stability punctuated by sudden, dramatic shifts. In stable periods, dominant policy narratives reinforce existing power structures, making major change difficult. But when external pressures, such as media attention, shifts in public opinion, or political crises, destabilize these narratives, rapid change becomes possible. A striking example of punctuated equilibrium is seen in the shifting focus of U.S. drug policy. For decades, a policy monopoly rooted in law enforcement and criminalization dominated the political landscape. This approach was reinforced by powerful federal agencies, strong public support for punitive measures, and interest groups advocating for strict drug laws. However, in the 1960s, changing social attitudes, coupled with a rise in drug use, disrupted this equilibrium. As media coverage intensified and policymakers faced pressure to address the crisis, the federal government briefly embraced treatment and education-based solutions, marking a significant departure from past enforcement-heavy approaches. Yet, as Baumgartner and Jones highlight, these shifts are rarely permanent. In the 1980s, a new wave of political pressure and media panic led to a return of strict enforcement policies under Presidents Reagan and Bush, reinforcing the original policy monopoly. This oscillation between different policy approaches demonstrates how policy stability is maintained until external forces disrupt it, leading to sudden shifts before a new equilibrium is established. Agenda setting, problems, politics, and visible participants. In his work on agenda setting, John Kingdon provides a complementary framework that explains how issues reach the forefront of policy debates. According to Kingdon, policymaking is shaped by three major streams. 1. The problem stream, issues that demand government attention due to statistical indicators, focusing events, e.g., crises, or public feedback. 2. The political stream, the broader political environment, including elections, shifts in national mood, and changes in political leadership. 3. The policy stream, a set of policy alternatives that experts, interest groups, and bureaucrats develop over time. For a policy to advance, all three streams must converge, creating a window of opportunity that allows change to occur. However, even when a problem is pressing, it may fail to gain traction if the political climate is not receptive or if viable policy alternatives are lacking. This model helps explain why some issues dominate policy discussions while others are ignored. For instance, Child abuse and drug addiction have been widely acknowledged as serious problems, yet political will and proposed solutions have fluctuated over time. In contrast, more politically advantageous issues, such as tax cuts or national security, often find easy paths onto the agenda, as they align more directly with partisan priorities. Visible versus hidden participants in agenda setting. While elected officials and the media often receive the most attention for shaping policy debates, Kingdon distinguishes between visible and hidden participants in the agenda-setting process. Visible participants, such as the President, members of Congress, and high-profile advocacy groups, play a major role in elevating issues to public prominence. However, much of the real policymaking work is done behind the scenes by hidden participants, including bureaucrats, policy specialists, and congressional staffers, who develop the actual policy alternatives that are eventually debated. For example, the rise of health maintenance organizations, HMOs, in the U.S. was largely driven by Paul Elwood and a network of health policy experts who spent years crafting proposals before they were ultimately embraced by policymakers. This illustrates how hidden participants often shape policy long before an issue gains public traction. Part 2. Policy monopolies and institutional stability. The construction and collapse of a policy monopoly. A policy monopoly exists when a dominant narrative and institutional structure sustain a particular policy approach, preventing significant change. These monopolies are maintained by strong coalitions of interest groups, government agencies, and political allies who benefit from the status quo. For decades, narcotics enforcement dominated U.S. drug policy. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, led by Henry Anslinger from 1930 to 1962, successfully framed drug use as a criminal issue, ensuring that law enforcement remained the primary approach. Even as alternative models, such as medical treatment, gained support, the entrenched power of law enforcement agencies and anti-drug advocacy groups kept punitive measures at the center of federal policy. However, policy monopolies can collapse when 1. New actors gain influence, e.g., medical professionals advocating for drug treatment. 2. Media narratives shift, highlighting alternative perspectives. 3. Political leadership changes, opening new policy windows. The 1960s drug policy shift demonstrated this, as growing concern over addiction led to the adoption of treatment-based approaches. However, as media panic over drugs resurged in the 1980s, the monopoly reasserted itself, leading to the war on drugs and a return to enforcement-heavy policies. Part 3. The role of valence issues in policy agendas. What are valence issues? A valence issue is one where there is widespread agreement on the problem itself, but disagreement over the appropriate solution. Unlike polarizing issues such as abortion or tax policy, valence issues are politically safe, as few people openly oppose their core premise. Key examples of valence issues include drug abuse. Everyone agrees it is a problem, but debates persist over whether enforcement or treatment is the best response. Child abuse. While universally condemned, tensions exist between state intervention and parental rights. National security. Policymakers agree on the importance of security, but disagree on methods such as military intervention versus diplomacy. Symbolic versus substantive policy responses. Because valence issues generate public concern but lack clear solutions, they are often used symbolically by politicians. This means leaders may advocate for strong action, such as harsh drug penalties or tougher child protection laws, while failing to implement policies that effectively address root causes. For instance, Reagan's 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act allocated billions to law enforcement, but little to prevention or treatment, reflecting a preference for symbolic tough-on-crime policies rather than substantive solutions. Conclusion. Policy agendas are shaped by problem recognition, political forces, and institutional structures. While valence issues often rise to prominence, their complexity makes effective policymaking difficult. Political cycles, media attention, and interest group influence drive the rise and fall of policy priorities, demonstrating that policy change is rarely linear, but instead shaped by long periods of stability punctuated by sudden shifts. Understanding these mechanisms is critical for policymakers and advocates seeking to navigate the complex landscape of agenda setting and policy change. This version expands the content, ensuring depth while maintaining readability. Let me know if you'd like further refinements.